Hello and welcome back to Watching Brief for the week of the 25th of April 2022. I am joined as ever by my fantastic co-host, Mr. Andy Brockman, who's been having some gas problems this week as opposed to his normal hot air issue.
Thank you, Mark. I think I better interpret that for our viewer who speaks to the Mid-Atlantic and American.
Uh-huh.
By gas, he's talking about the fuel rather than anything biological.
Yes. Yes, a domestic, not biological problem. Yes.
Exactly that. No. I couldn't record yesterday because we were having it was third time lucky in getting a new cooker delivered.
Yes.
Hence that was my gas problem. In fact, it wasn't even a direct gas problem. The problem with the old cooker was the fact that the oven door had fallen off.
Oh, okay. So it was just it was a hinge problem.
Yes, the whole future of House Brockman hinged on a new cooker door.
Oh, very nice, very nice. But whether we're making terrible puns or not, our Watching Brief continues. Our weekly, well, almost weekly this week, effort to bring to you the archaeological news of the week and to discuss and to encourage discussion in the comments below. And this week we have a few lines to keep an eye on. We have a few links of the week, in addition to our long-standing Disasters Emergency Committee link, as you can see on the screen. And also as well, we have a broader theme of contested heritage in times of both peace and war. So I suppose, first of all, the links of the week that we want to highlight this week, in addition to the Disasters Emergency Committee, include the ICOMOS International Day for Monuments and Sites theme for 2022 that was heritage and climate. Very pertinent, and we've actually there's a couple of articles down there with regards to that that came sort of at the beginning of last week when we intended to putting this Watching Brief out, but also as well the upcoming Council for British Archaeology Festival of Archaeology is it's not too far off, is it? It's an annual event, and it's well worth checking out.
Absolutely. And in fact, if you're in the UK and want to register an event, they're taking registrations for the festival as we speak. Details are on the website on the link.
Excellent. Now, I'm going to make sure that you're strict here. Okay, we've got some lines to talk about. So what lines are we pointing to, and therefore what should people keep an eye on for the near future?
Well, the first line is actually connected with climate, albeit not absolutely directly. There is a row in London over the demolition of Marks and Spencer's, the department store's flagship Oxford Street Art Deco building. It has been going through planning. They have planning permission to demolish the existing building and build a new building on the same site. There's been a lot of opposition to it because the argument now is that certainly among many architects and many other people involved in the environmental movement, that retrofit is a better climate, response to the climate emergency than demolition and rebuilding with all the embodied carbon that represents. The Marks and Spencers have countered that over the lifetime of the building, the carbon situation isn't as bad as opponents maintain. The situation now is that the government has actually overruled the local authority, Westminster, who gave planning permission, and have what's termed called in the planning application. It'll now be determined by Michael Gove, who's the relevant government minister. It's being seen as something of a test case for whether the current planning rules are up to strength in terms of enabling local authorities, planning authorities, to insist on more carbon friendly, more climate emergency responsive planning applications.
Well, and this is something that we have touched on in the past, especially when it comes to questions. Initially, I think we highlighted this with regards to museums, for example, and whether or not the fact that you might want a brand new shiny wing for your museum, or even a whole new site, may or may not be the most responsible way of proceeding, and whether or not archaeologists and historians and curators and others should be on board with wholesale reconstruction as opposed to repurposing, and as you say, considering notions of embodied carbon. So, yeah, okay, so that's a test case, and presumably, because I know that you and I have a climate special possibly in mind at some point in the near future,
we might.
Presumably, this is something that we may well be referring to again.
Absolutely. I think it's something that certainly the whole issue of embodied carbon and retrofit versus new build is something that the architectural profession is engaging with. Developers have reasons not to, because new build has tax advantages, particularly VAT, value added tax, which isn't charged on new builds but is charged on retrofits. And yes, it's some, but archaeologists, of course, are involved because archaeologists are involved in the planning process.
Yeah, exactly. But also as well, I think there are strong cultural, emotional draws as well. The idea of we're going to build a new building to house the exhibition for, I don't know, King Mobby Bob and his Saxon entourage or something. That sounds cooler in a press release and sounds more like you're doing something in the community than saying we're going to repurpose this building for the purposes of. So I think it's also about moving people's attitudes along as well, isn't it? Away from this notion of prestige building almost.
Yeah, I've certainly been involved in planning cases and observed planning cases where, for example, local councillors on planning committees have seen new as progressive and preserving the past as regressive.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, you plonked this in my lap just before we started recording. Something from the National Infrastructure Planning gov.uk website. And
it's riveting, isn't it?
I can't quite figure out what I'm looking at. It just says A303 Stonehenge. The responses to the Secretary of State's consultation letter 24th of February has been published. Is that it? Is that what this is about?
No, what this is about, new readers start here, or new viewers start here. People who've been following the Watching Brief for a while will know that we've regularly carried updates on the attempt of Highways England to build a tunnel. Stonehenge to build a tunnel and dual carriageway across the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site. It split the archaeological community, it split the local community, it split it hasn't really split the environmental community because most environmental organisations are against it. They see it. We talked about carbon earlier in the show. It's seen as an out-of-date 1970s, 1980s solution to a transport problem that is damaging in these days of the climate emergency. Anything that is likely to encourage traffic and traffic moving faster is seen as a bad thing. The project, the A303 project, was stopped just before Christmas by a judicial review, which found that the government had acted unlawfully on 2 counts. The government then, under Transport Secretary Grant Shapps, then asked for further submissions with a view to deciding the future of the project. Those submissions have just been published on the Department for Transport website by the Planning Inspectorate. There are, I think, 1,206 separate documents that you can look at if you're interested. But we talked about the Marks and Spencers in Oxford Street being a test case for conservation, the environment and building. Stonehenge is building up to be something very similar.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so there's a documents tab there, isn't there? Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, what I would say, I'd just like to, that there is one document on there which is an absolute classic. It's a letter opposing the building of the tunnel and dual carriageways, but it suggests that the government has a pre-planned response that all those letters will have had, which is along the lines of, "Thank you very much for your response to the Secretary of State's consultation over the A303 at Stonehenge. Your reply will be considered carefully by the Secretary of State before we go ahead with what we wanted to do anyway."
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. He'll consider it carefully. momentarily.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Not that anyone's cynical about this process or anything.
No, and not that particular politician has described all of this sort of stuff as very deeply inconvenient. Not at all.
Yes, yes.
Stopping
That
business
was covered in the previous
business of government moving at the rate that it wants to move.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah, I think we've done fairly well there. We've got the lines, the initial lines out of the way. These are things to keep an eye on. That's a solid 15 minutes of this half-hour show, he says.
Right.
And now we're going to move on to our main two segments. So first of all, we come to the story of Montpelier in Virginia. This is the home of the United States' fourth president, I do believe.
That's right.
James Madison. And it is a historic site. The website, for example, even has a tab which is all about the archaeology on the site, and have lots of smiley faces doing digging and looking at artifacts. It's got reenacting and all sorts of things happening on the site. So it's a very historic site. But the headline that you brought to my attention initially was Montpelier says it is open to parity with slave descendants, but descendants call foul. What's going on there?
Right. This is a very bitter and complicated row that's going on as we speak. It hasn't been resolved yet. And for anyone who really wants to get to grips with this, we're linking to a National Public Radio page, which includes a 4-minute listen explaining the background to the dispute. Basically, the Montpelier estate, Montpelier plantation in Virginia, which was the home of President Madison, fourth president of the United States. And Madison's important because he was a key figure in writing the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He's a major historical figure. The Montpelier estate is now run by a foundation, which has a board of directors. And as with many historical figures in the last 10 years or so, the involvement of James Madison with slavery and enslaved people who basically ran the estate, worked the estate, kept the estate going, is now a major issue in how the estate's being presented to people, to visitors. Cut to the chase. Last year, a group called the Montpelier Descendants Committee, who represent around 300 descendants of the enslaved people who worked on the Montpelier estate, thought they'd reached an agreement with the board of directors whereby the board would take on to its strength members of the MDC, so that what the effect of this will be that there will be parity between a sort of more, I suppose, a more traditional James Madison focused presentation of the estate, and the enslaved people who made the estate possible, who supplied Madison with his wealth, that made him, that enabled him to be that major political figure, the person who'd been involved in writing the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. The current row is that the board of directors are accused of reneging on the agreement. The result of that was that senior members of staff, including archaeologists, complained and were fired. And the situation now is that there is a major row over the whole issue. Organizations like the Society for American Archaeology, for example, have come out with statements supporting the sacked staff and the MDC. The current board is under a lot of pressure to backtrack and return to its original what is claimed to be in its original agreement. The latest appears to be that they have agreed to take on members of the MDC, but in a way that means that the current board maintains a majority until at least the autumn.
Yeah.
And the protesters find that unacceptable.
And this is because they can put things in place in the meantime that might make further work difficult.
That's right. And for example, not rehiring the staff that they fired.
Exactly. Yeah, because by then they have to have found another job, probably. Yeah.
Yes.
It is interesting, actually, to see the Society for American Archaeology and how they handled this, actually. They had a statement initially issued on the 13th of April with a PDF version available, so people could sort of download it and share it around. But then they followed that up on the 21st when the situation had changed again. So they were very much on top of this. And they seem to be, well, as they said here, these firings are completely unacceptable and constitute an egregious violation of freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry. So these are archaeologists in the US supporting open inquiry and freedom of speech. And it's interesting because, I think similar things are happening at the moment in this country when it comes to, for example, especially national trust properties. There are some people who are being very loud about whether or not we should be learning the full context of the history of a house, as opposed to the fact that it essentially looks like something from a Jane Austen denouement, where the hero and the heroine live happily ever after. And often these conversations, they lead to quite emotive back and forth, and very rarely actually are they resolved in a way which satisfies everyone. And at the very least,
I think it's.
So go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I think it's probably worth illustrating what that comment you just made by looking at some of the quotes that is on the NPR account of what's been going on. They suggest that this is a dispute that's been in the making for a long time. They also quote Elizabeth Chu, who is one of the employees who was sacked by the current board. What she says is, quote, and this is all in quotes, so it's well sourced. It's not hearsay. Basically, what they're afraid of is the MDC, obviously the Descendants Committee, taking over the board. And she goes on to allege an environment that the NPR describes as rife with racism. They quote that multiple people allege that one current board member described a black person as having intimidated him with a, quote, Frederick Douglass stare. And Elizabeth Chu says that the argument is rooted in what she argues that the current board see as, quote, angry black folk.
Well, and that's the thing, because Frederick Douglass was a famous anti-slavery advocate. He was a former slave. He famously, I believe, wrote a book on the issue. He spoke about it around the world. He was invited to speak in his day on the issue of slavery. And he was actively seeking cultural, financial, emotional recompense. He was badgering people because he had experienced this himself. So again, it's well, as I say, it's emotive. It brings out emotive.
Well, again, look, in fairness, I need to quote Gene Hickok, who's the current chair of the board. He countered the arguments put forward by the protesters and by the MDC. He said, in quotes again, the Montpelier Descendants Committee, through its leadership, has worked relentlessly for months to create dissension and division among the staff of James Madison's Montpelier. Some members of Montpelier staff have, as a result, spoken disparagingly, even hatefully, of the volunteer board that governs this historic American treasure. The atmosphere at Montpelier had become untenable and toxic, aggravated by misleading public statements made by the MDC and by bias demonstrated by the National Trust for Historic Preservation. That's the ultimate owner of the estate. Work was not getting done. Projects were being halted. Montpellier's leadership could not allow that to continue. Employees say that actually is not true. They argue that the board has actually made misleading statements. They suggest that the board's been underhanded. They present themselves as being kind and caring, and then behind the scenes, when no one's looking, have been simply bullying and trying to intimidate and foster an atmosphere of fear and just a toxic working environment. That's Matt Reeves, who's another one of the staff that was terminated. He was the director of archaeology and landscape restoration.
And ultimately, all of this comes about because people really care about the past, and they care about the story that they are thinking of as being most important in a given situation or a given site. And for the most part, unfortunately, people tend to think that history tends to be one narrative, one story, one particular strand. And I certainly don't want to make definitive statements on what's happening in Montpellier, but I can absolutely understand how it is that you might have some intransigent people who are wanting to protect the legacy of a great figure of history, as they might describe them, and other people wanting to expand and explore the heritage and the history, and also the economic circumstances surrounding that great figure of history. And so, even if with the best of intentions, a historic site is always going to be contested in some way, even if it's just perfectly friendly professional historians who look at one document and interpret it in two different ways. There's always the potential for interpretive conflict on a site in that sense. But when it is tied to a national figure, and also very current issues, still current issues of economics, identity, race, the legacy of slavery, for example, and also perceptions of other people in a modern society, naturally it's going to have the potential to bubble up. And I mean, there's a case study close to home that we're going to look at in just a second. But I mean, do you have any final thoughts on this one?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think just to reinforce that idea you've just been expounding about contested sites, Matt Reeves, the archaeologist I spoke about earlier, is quoted further in the article as saying that what the board want to do is, quote, a complete perversion of everything that is Montpellier. It shows to them what they see as Montpellier is not history, not the work that we've done. That's the archaeologists, the historians, the MDC, looking at the history of the enslaved people. And he says it's something else that is terrifying to think, and it's terrifying to think what they'll undo and create. In other words, that the work that has been done to not foreground, but just include appropriately the lives of those enslaved Africans, those enslaved people, is somehow going to be, again, backgrounded to bring President Madison back to the fore. And underlying it is, you know, it's these are very, very difficult conversations. I think I'll just finish. The chair of the MDC said the CEO and chairman of the current board continue to blame everyone but themselves for the sad situation. They're in a deep bubble of denial. And in fact, the MDC's attorney, Gene Werkheiser, said quite bluntly, usually racists these days are more competent.
Which itself isn't, it gets messy, doesn't it? And
it's very, very messy. Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, this reminded us of a story that's happening at the moment here in a place called Stroud, where Stroud District Council is set to recommend the removal of a clock, and this is a clock that's been in the headline here. It's called the Black Boy Clock. A 248-year-old clock which has been described as an offensive racist relic, end quotes, should be taken down, the council has said, in the context of seemingly at least a year's worth of people calling in the most recent instance for this clock to be removed. An anti-racism campaign was began calling for the removal of the clock that they said glamorizes the slave trade. The Black Boy clock in Stroud at that point was 247 years old, 1 year younger, and features a statue that sits on the side of a Grade 2 listed building in Gloucestershire. The clock, interestingly, hasn't always been there. It was created by a watchmaker, John Miles, in 1774, and has been in various locations in the town. But in 1844, it was moved to its current site and location in what was then a national school for girls. And it's a clock above which is a recess with a little, almost an eave, a small sort of almost like porch-like roof structure, under which is the figure of a child, a black child, an African child, who stands ready to strike the bell when the clock chimes, presumably on the quarter, half, and full hour. This figure will act, and again, it becomes quite difficult because 1844 is a long time ago. It's certainly more than a lifetime ago. So for some people, that is just where the clock has always been. For some people, this is a relic of a bygone attitude. But also for others, it's a very current demonstration of current issues. And for example, one person described the boy as being restrained at the neck by a cord which is attached to the building. But as far as we can tell from images, at least, this may in fact simply be there to ensure that the statue doesn't fall over. I don't think this is necessarily part of the depiction of an African person from the 1700s. But that said, though, the quality of the depiction, as you pointed out, isn't particularly good anyway, is it? It's not actually a picture of a real human in that sense.
You look at the image now with 21st century eyes, and it looks like a very sort of rustic image of a fantasy of what a black person actually looked like, created by somebody who probably hadn't met many, if any, black people in their everyday life, but maybe was familiar with the sort of patronizing images that you found on broadsheets and so on. And it's contemporary. And I think one of the reasons it's distasteful to look at now, obviously it was created before slavery was abolished in Britain and the British Empire. It is also from a time when, if you look at portraits of aristocrats, you sometimes find, for example, that they're portrayed with black servants, often children, who are almost dressed up as mascots. They're there as one of the badges of wealth, being followed by a hunting dog. You're followed by a hunting dog and your black child slave. It's really offensive in modern eyes.
Yeah, well, almost like an accessory. Yeah,
that's right. A fashion accessory. Yes, a fashion accessory. That's a very good way of describing it, actually. Yeah. These are human beings being treated as fashion accessories and having no choice about it and having no agency in it. So that's the cultural background of this thing. So yes, of course, it's very upsetting and offensive to modern eyes. It's complicated by a number of things. One is the fact that this is a rare structure. The clock mechanism is in itself rare. And it's on a Grade 2 listed building, which means that any changes, including removing the figure, require scheduled listed building consent. Now, that means that any decision would have to be decided by the Secretary of State, currently Nadine Dorries.
Sorry, Nadine Dynamite Dorries. That would be
Dynamite Dorries. Yeah, the Secretary of State for Culture.
Oh, but you really caught me out with that one. Sorry. Go on. And of course, she'd be very sensitive about this, I'm sure.
Well, she is one of the leading proponents in the cabinet, we understand, of the so-called culture war. Part of the culture war is to retain and explain.
Yeah.
And in fact, Historic England have expressed concerns about the impact of removal on the integrity and significance of the building. They say that, for example, it would harm the significance of the listed building and the character of the conservation area. That, you know, there are two statutory characteristics of this location that make it more complicated than otherwise to move this piece. The local MP, it also follows the government line, Siobhan Bailey. She says that she quotes opposes the removal of history and statues. To do so serves no purpose other than to allow some people to decide or be selective with history or decide what is most comfortable and cause no offence.
That, I mean, as we've discussed in previous watching briefs, that's not the issue, and also you shouldn't conflate history and statues as being the same thing. But in this instance, what's interesting as well is that this is really crucial. This is where, again, these knotty issues have to be really carefully examined. As much as I'm uncomfortable with that image, I wouldn't ask for it to be removed. So the MP can jog on, please. Thank you very much. In so much as at the very least here it says it could not be verified that this is actually supposed to be a slave. It could be a very low paid employee, as it were, that being depicted in this instance. Whatever the inspiration or its origins, said Stroud Council, I believe, it has to be remembered that without a doubt the boy's image came directly or indirectly through the influence of slavery and colonialism nonetheless. So it comes down to then, I suppose, a legitimate question as to what the current culture and society and the people of Stroud think about these matters and these issues. And then this is where this matter of statues, and as we've touched on previously, seemingly endlessly in some ways in this country, Colston, etc. Is at what point is it okay for a community to decide to change something? Because after all, history is the story of changes, and also, in this instance, the clock, for example, has been in different places at different times. So there's a lot to weigh up and to balance. And so I think we thought, speaking of balance, we thought this sort of balanced out somewhat the Montpelier story in terms of complexities that are inherent.
Absolutely, but and I think also it talking of complexities, it points up the legal complexities. You know, Montpelier, there are issues of governance and representation and so on, and lack of consultation and arguably high-handed, inappropriate behaviour on the part of, for example, it's alleged the board. Here, you've got a council that's arguably trying to do the right thing in representing different views and giving different views the opportunity to promote themselves within a civil discourse and within a process. You have then that process interacting with government. And in fact, I mentioned Nadine Dorris. There's also listed building consent comes from the Secretary of State for Culture, but planning permission is the Department for Communities and Levelling Up, which is Michael Gove. So there are two government departments involved potentially in a government which has a policy of retain and explain. So it's complicated. We started off talking about contested heritage. It's very much contested heritage. There's a part of Britain called the Black Country, which is about industrialization. It's about black smoke and soot and so on. It's nothing to do
coal
with
and stuff,
skin color and race. It's to do with it's the cradle of the Industrial Revolution. It's where Iron Bridge Gorge can be found, and if people are familiar with the Peaky Blinders, the Black Country Living History Museum where the Peaky Blinders is filmed or was filmed, is part of the Black Country, as the name suggests. There's a town in the Black Country called Stourbridge, which I know very well. And when I first started going there in the 1990s, I went to a local pub Victorian pub called the Labour in Vain. And the Labour in Vain had some very beautifully etched glass windows. It was very arts and craft movement style in terms of the imagery. These are probably at least 100 years old. Very, very well crafted. Except that the key image illustrating the idea of labouring in vain was a group of white women surrounding a bathtub in which was a black child, whose skin they were trying to clean. Now, you can imagine that even back in the 1990s, that was a very, very difficult image.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting actually in the Labour in Vain with a family friend who actually was a producer with Radio 4 at the time, BBC Radio 4, and is of Asian heritage himself. And we were discussing this image and whether it should become, whether we should start talking about it, and whether it was possible to do something with the story. So all this while we were trying to watch Manchester United win a football match. He was a Man U fan, I was in neutral. But recently, when I went past the pub again, those windows have been taken out, removed. Now,
Right.
I'm not aware that there was a row over it. I don't know where they've gone, whether they've been preserved or whether they were destroyed. But I have to say, I'm not unhappy that they are no longer there, because I think it would, even a retain and explain would not do other than make them a really uncomfortable and actually offensive image. You can argue that in an exhibition in a museum about race, they might be appropriate, but not in public, in open view at eye level when you walk past in the street.
Well, and that's the point, isn't it? You know, the world turns, things change. We are allowed to change how we interact with our history.
Most of our churches have whitewashed interiors because in the Reformation, the medieval wall paintings were deemed as sacrilegious and had to be covered up.
That's true. Yeah. Although there's a wonderful section in the Galilee Chapel in Durham Cathedral where they've managed to take off some of the whitewashing. You can see some of the old artwork. So you get a hint at just how riotous the building would have been. But again, that's people changing how they relate to their immediate history, never mind long-standing heritage. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah.
But of course, contested heritage is universal, whether in a time of peace or a time of war. And it seems that wherever there is war, heritage is even more acutely contested and indeed used as a prop in if you want to call a war a contest, in that friction between at least two or more groups. I remember last year, for example, I believe in Watching Brief, we touched on the situation in Ethiopia following a conversation that began on the Archaeosoup Facebook page, where I had shared news that Lalibela and other sites were potentially at risk from troops moving into those internationally famous Ethiopian religious and historical places. One person in particular responded saying, "Don't worry, most of the people involved here are Christians, and therefore the sites aren't at risk." Never mind the fact that there is a Muslim contingent, and never mind the fact that, for example, I suggested, have you heard about the Reformation in this country, in England, for example, or the Civil War? People with the same or very similar religious beliefs. Northern Ireland, for goodness sake, I mean, that's not
the
an argument.
The Byzantine iconoclasts. I mean, you could look at any period in history virtually.
Yeah, it's possible for those people to fight and to destroy each other's cultural property. And in this instance, there's an article here. It is from last year, but it's pertinent. It points out that roughly 60% of the population of Ethiopia have an Ethiopian Orthodox Christian faith. But that doesn't stop churches across the country. It hasn't stopped it, particularly in November last year. This article is talking about seeing culturally important places and historically important places being used as a strategy. I mean, the article here asks the question: why would Ethiopian authorities allow for the assault on sites such as the Church of Saint Mary of Zion, or sites from the 7th century, such as the Wukro al Najashi Mosque, to proceed? And the conclusion, or one of the conclusions here, is that the most persuasive explanation is that, therefore, that this strategy, quote, is aimed at humiliating and demoralizing populations to break communities' resolve and spirit. It's in its most extreme form, this is known in international law as cultural genocide. There's a very strong and heavily weighted words, but I think that's a legal definition as opposed to something that's intended to make you go emotionally. The intended effect is to erase people's attachment to land, uprooting them not only physically but psychologically, religiously and culturally, I would add there. Destroying religious sites is a powerful instrument in this approach. And in this instance, it's the conflict in Ethiopia is complicated, and like I said, we have touched on this previously, but it's ongoing, and we're seeing this year similar things being reported, at least in Ukraine. That, seeing as we are recording today, I'll cheat a little bit and put a link into the agenda that I saw today, where I think the Art newspaper was talking about how we need to be very careful when examining people's claims as to destruction of cultural heritage in their countries, because the people who are claiming loss have a reason to magnify that loss and to blame the people who they claim are destroying said cultural and religious heritage.
Anybody who watched our interview with Alina a few weeks ago, I think one of the main takeaways from that is, particularly in an area that's contentious like this, check your sources again, ask who, what, when, where, why, and then check your sources again, because it's so easy to be misled by perhaps even something that you want to be true, that falls into your particular comfort zone on a particular area. It is so important not to allow that to happen and to keep the rigor.
Or perhaps to rephrase that, not just something that you want to be true, but something that adds to your intellectual argument, shall we say. So you may not want something to have been destroyed, but if it has been destroyed, it adds to your argument that those people over there are the baddies.
Exactly that. Exactly that. And, for example, people could argue that this week's destruction of the so-called friendship statue in Kyiv, which was a statue that was put up in Soviet times to the people of Ukraine and the people of the Soviet Union fighting together against fascism, was somehow a piece of cultural vandalism. Although, as
erasing history, as a minister here might say.
Well, this is the thing, but then on the other hand, when somebody is currently trying to erase your history with shells and guided missiles, are you really supposed to expect something like that to go uncontested? We are in very, very difficult areas here. It comes as part of a developing story, really, of what has happened in particularly occupied areas of Ukraine since 2014. There is a UNESCO report that came out in the autumn of last year, 2021, which looked at what had happened in occupied Crimea, where it is argued the government of the Russian Federation under President Putin has promoted a history of a Russian Crimea over a more complex history of a Crimea that was part of Ukraine until it was taken over, annexed by Russia in 2014, and which downplays, for example, cultures like the Crimean Tatars. And also it alleges, for example, illegal archaeological excavations, illegal in that they're not authorized by the government of Ukraine, which is still under the, legally, internationally, its Ukrainian territory,
Mm-hmm.
and the removal of artifacts to museums in the Russian Federation, including in Moscow. Now, that is done. That is done very deliberately because it is argued under President Putin's Greater Russia policy, Crimea has no independent existence, and Ukraine has no independent existence. They're part of Greater Russia. And so this cultural campaign is going on alongside the military campaign. The latest document, the one from the Antiquities Coalition, it's part of a series of briefing notes that have been published by the Antiquities Coalition. They're an organization, an expert organization that seeks to provide information to governments and NGOs and so on about issues of cultural crime, racketeering, illicit trade, and art and antiquities and so on, and their interaction with armed conflict. This particular briefing note is by Daniel Schultz, Dr. Daniel Schultz, and Dr. Christopher Jasparo, who are two American academics. They have in the past worked for the United States Naval War College and the Department of Defense, so they're very keyed into government thinking. Now, some people will see that as a red flag, that they're arguing from a point of view of bias, being pro-West, pro-NATO, and so on. I think if you read the document, it's actually a very well-written, well-researched academic discussion of the issue of how the Russian Federation under President Putin operates. It talks, for example, about Russia's use of revisionist historical narratives. We're seeing it in Ukraine now, where Ukraine is a Nazi regime. And just in the last couple of days, we've seen Russian media propagandists referring to NATO, Western countries and NATO as having supported Nazi Germany against Russia. Absolutely not true, but there are these attempts to other the opposition. They make a series. Cuts to the chase. They make a series of recommendations, which I'll just outline briefly, and then people can maybe go away and think about how these impact on their own practice. Because I think we've seen observations when we've tried to raise the issue of Ukraine in the archaeological sphere in the UK, at least, that we're Britain. We only work in England. We only work in Britain. We're too small for to have a regard for this. We want to talk about archaeology. In fact, this is absolutely about archaeology. It's about the entire international landscape within which archaeologists operate, and the way that what archaeologists do can be manipulated by political actors, for good or for ill.
Well, and that's the thing. I don't think I had fully identified that thread until a few moments ago, whereby, as you say, everything that we've been talking about in this episode, and it has been a slightly longer than planned episode, is about the way in which people alive now, or at any given point in history, relate to their past and use their past to prove various points in times of peace and in times of war as well, and conflict. Sorry, go ahead. But the very idea that you can separate the two, past from people attempting to prove political points or to win wars, is nonsensical.
I that's what I'd argue, certainly. Absolutely. And I think the recommendations that Schultz and Jasparo come up with, they're only 5. They're quite short, and I think they make sense. So what they recommend to people trying to deal with Russian cultural warfare, and I think it's appropriate to use those terms, but it's not just about Russia. It's about any entity that seeks to misrepresent history for political reasons, for reasons of conflict. So what they argue is that we should raise awareness and build resilience of propaganda tactics and aims and narratives to help avoid actions that actually support those narratives.
Mm-hmm.
They say institutionalize the threat. Countering history-based influence activities should be integrated into exercises, scenarios, planning processes, policy and doctrine throughout defense and security and governmental establishments.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They suggest exploiting opportunities to analyze propaganda narratives and understand what the adversary perceives as a threat, along with revealing what those narratives suggest about intentions about future actions. That's when you have people talking about, oh, Ukraine never had a historical identity of its own, it was always part of Russia. It's that kind of argument. That suggests that if you accept that historical argument, then it's very easy to have a special military operation to get rid of the Nazi regime and so on. You see how it goes. Then so the first parts really are about building structures, resilience, building these issues into planning, and then looking at what those narratives tell us about how things might turn out. The last two are practical measures that can be taken to counter. One is counter messaging, which is to basically operate within the narrative framework that you're opposing, rather than directly confronting the sort of existential worldviews of the target audience, particularly when they might have been manipulated by years of propaganda putting forward a particular view. So don't just bash people over the head, basically. Work from within the narratives they're already understanding, and then message carefully, effectively within those narrative frameworks. And finally, and again, this is very counterintuitive, I think, for all of us who work in history and archaeology, it says avoid overemphasizing history. And I'll quote directly here because it's an important point, and I think it's the one I'd like to leave our audience with. It said, they argue, correcting historical fallacies is important, but it must be made clear to audiences that adversary appeals to history are irrelevant to discussions of current state, sovereignty, democracy, and self-determination.
And what do you think that means? In so much as is it a case of, well, we are actually where we are, and we have to have conversations about where we are? Is that what it's saying?
Exactly. It's saying basically, it doesn't matter, if you believe that the fact that the Kievan Rus and Prince Vladimir existed and went on to be the foundations of the modern Russian nation state. So what matters now is that a state called Ukraine was created in the breakup of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, and is independent and is a sovereign democracy and does not want to be part of Russia.
Right. Yes, I see. Yeah.
And that's the important point.
Because if you start with the former, you're immediately challenging someone's perception of the world, their identity, their theirs, as it were, rather than talking about, well, actually, these people on that street over there simply don't want to be part of your political system.
Exactly. That's it. Exactly it. Yeah. Exactly it.
Interesting.
It's a very interesting paper. I do urge people to read it.
Yeah, and there are a couple of other links as well we've put below, relevant to ongoing efforts. For example, there's the Canadian team that are involved in the global effort to save Ukrainian digital history and so on and so forth. So do check those out. In case it's not entirely clear, folks at home, we have been having some technical issues this afternoon. And actually, at times it's felt a little bit like Andy and I have been on slightly parallel tracks in terms of the delay on our calls. So hopefully, what our conversation has been about has come across clearly. But please do continue this conversation below in the comments. We're very interested to genuinely examine these issues of contested history and heritage, and this is the whole point of this episode.
Absolutely, I would say that there are probably few more important issues facing us as historians, as archaeologists, in our practice, but also in our everyday lives, actually, and in our everyday relationships with the people we share the planet with, than these issues.
Yeah, yeah. We may well share a planet, but we don't necessarily share the best internet connection, unfortunately. Thank you very much for your time this week, Andy. Thank you, folks at home, for tuning in and for listening. As I say, please do comment below. Please do message us. There's an email below there. Andy's DMs are open. I'm contactable in various ways if you have any stories that you'd like us to examine or to cover. And is there any hint at what might be coming next, Andy, for the Watching Brief?
I'm going to be mysterious, and there are. I think there's a major maritime story coming down the tracks,
okay.
And also there are always stories about metal detecting coming down the tracks.
I see. Interesting. Grand. Thanks for watching, guys. Until next time, do take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.